So we have as our third speaker Dr. Armin Krishnan from East Carolina University in the US, who's going to give us a couple of examples of how neuroscience could actually be used for military applications.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to participate in the debate on dual use of neuroscience, and I want to contribute a few thoughts about the ethics of AI and autonomous weapons. My short presentation is structured in the following way. First, I will speak a bit about the dangers of strong AI and the dual use problem. Secondly, I will address the problem or the issue of neuromorphic computing for weapons applications. I will mostly speak about, and I will finally propose some solutions. So there is no doubt that AI research will have a massive impact on society in the coming decades, and the biggest problem will be the displacement of jobs due to automation and the social consequences that come with that: high unemployment, poverty, political instability. A second concern is the general decline in human decision-making, so there will be a growing dependency on machines, and there will be a declining ability to understand decisions generated by computers and to effectively interfere with computerized decision-making. And eventually, humanity will face the prospect of artificial superintelligence. Obviously, nobody knows when that is going to happen, but it could happen within the century, maybe by the middle of the century. And the problem is that we would not know how the super AI will behave towards humans, and we would have a big problem keeping it in a box or to fully control it. Well, as it has been mentioned, all technology can be used for good and evil. So there is always a risk calculation or a calculation of benefits versus risks. The problem is, how do you deal with risks of human extinction? So what is an acceptable risk if the technology in question could threaten the survival of humanity? And some prominent scientists have pointed out that AI could be such a technology. So what are the options? Well, we could relinquish the development of the technology completely. We could put ethical restrictions on the development of the technology, which we're trying to do with biotechnology. Or we could simply push ahead with technology development in the hope that solutions will eventually present themselves as we go along. And that has been also suggested by several scientists. So I now come to the advantages of neuromorphic computing. So as I understand it, it is very powerful in pattern recognition, which is something humans excel and that is very difficult for classical computing. There is a greatly reduced energy needs, which means that supercomputing could become a lot cheaper, and it would also allow for greater miniaturization. And obviously, since neuromorphic computing tries to mimic the human brain, there is a good chance that it could lead to artificial general intelligence or human-level artificial intelligence. So what are the weapons applications? A big concern that I have is the possibility of ubiquitous automated surveillance and the possibility of a pre-crime scenario. So the automated surveillance system flags behaviors that are not in themselves criminal or dangerous, and may even propose ways of neutralizing that threat before it emerges. A second application is automated target recognition for terminal guidance or human decision support. So we could move from a human in the loop to a human on the loop. So the machine would do 99% of the job, and the human would just confirm decisions already made by the machine. And that could lead to the eventual emergence of fully autonomous weapon systems where you don't have a human in the loop anymore. So what does weapons autonomy entail, or what could it entail? Basically it means that the weapon system can carry out its core mission without human intervention. Secondly, it would mean that the weapon system can learn and adapt to changing circumstances. That would be particularly important for offensive type of applications. The weapon systems could be able to scavenge energy or could be energy self-sufficient. So that would be important if you just release the weapon systems in the environment, and then it could operate there for an extended period of time. Autonomy could mean that the weapon system can self-repair or self-heal. And that would be very important because you don't need to have a human who takes care of the maintenance of the machine all the time. And finally, autonomy could mean that the weapon system can self-replicate. And here I'm thinking mostly about nano or cyber type weapons. So what are the ethical upsides here? Obviously, autonomy makes military robots much more useful and effective for the military, and there are ethical benefits for doing so. Well, obviously, you don't need to put lives of soldiers at risk. It allows you to use less aggressive, non-lethal tactics because lives are not at stake. And there's always the hope that with automation there come cost reductions. So there would be a lower societal burden of defense if we pursue that technology. And some have argued that autonomous weapon systems might be more reliable and consistent in applying laws of armed conflict if they were ethically programmed. Now I come to the ethical downsides. Autonomy without human-level intelligence creates certain kinds of risks. Obviously, such an autonomous weapon systems would have a lesser ability than a human to understand the environment and would therefore be prone to make mistakes humans wouldn't make. There would always be the problem of unpredictable robot behavior. So there are always situations that are not foreseen by the programmers, and then you don't know what the robot is going to do. Ethics requires human judgment, and no system of ethics can be fully codified. So if you don't have human-level intelligence in the machine, then the machine will not be able to have that kind of judgment. And autonomous weapon systems may also pose a continuing threat after the termination of hostilities if they were released into the environment in large numbers. So they would be very difficult to collect and disable afterwards. Once we get to the point where we have human-level intelligence in machines, we might run into the issue of robot rights. So if we can have an intelligent conversation with a robot, we may think that it is necessary to give the robot some rights. So we might not want to put that machine at risk, similarly as a human. It could also mean that robots might be able to reject orders if they are capable of understanding and the world around them. And there could be the possibility that artificial general intelligence might evolve in artificial superintelligence, and that the machine may consider humans to be a threat to its existence. So that would be the Terminator scenario. What are other factors to consider here? Arms race dynamics. So getting there first can give militaries a decisive advantage. So there will be huge incentives to push the technology as far ahead as possible. We have to take into account the role of private actors. So unlike a large-scale technology like nuclear technology, AI could be, or artificial general intelligence or superintelligence could be achieved by private actors. So that would be very difficult to control. And then there's the uncertain time horizon. And so we don't know when it's going to happen. So I'm coming to the solutions. Well, it has been proposed to have an international ban of autonomous weapon systems, which would be, in any case, very difficult to enforce. There could be an international AI control regime, so we could put in place regulatory and verification mechanisms so to keep the capabilities limited of those machines. We could approach the problem in terms of machine ethics, so equip the weapon systems with some ethical framework. We could emphasize intelligence augmentation rather than artificial intelligence, so we could try to make humans smarter than trying to make the machines smarter, or try that the humans stay ahead in this intelligence race. And finally, if we can't resist developing artificial superintelligence, we should think about friendly AI. So make sure that the AI cares about humans and humanity and isn't hostile towards humans or indifferent towards humans. So I've reached the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Armin, for your presentation and these very interesting and some bit scary examples of what could be applications of artificial intelligence or neuroscience. I would like to ask perhaps Karl-Heinz Meyer to begin the discussion this time.
Well, okay, I can try again. And first of all, thank you, Armin, for this presentation, which I enjoyed a lot because it was very specific and very much to the point that I expected from this meeting. Also, for the list of solutions that you presented, which are interesting, but I don't know how realistic they are, of course. So my first question to you would be, I mean, in order to advance along the line of the solutions that you propose, you would first have to find out and know what's going on. So, I mean, from your experience or your previous work, I mean, what is your impression? How much do we really know of the research that's being performed in various parts of the world in this area? I mean, we know that there are lots of programs which are not as public as the European Commission. People do not publish their work, and probably a lot of things are happening that we have no idea of. So, I mean, how would you handle that problem? It may be that we are discussing things that are nice to do, but are already dramatically overridden by reality, that there are things that we don't know. So how would you address that point? How can we find out more? I know this is difficult to answer. You probably cannot answer it, but I see this as a major problem.
And you're absolutely right. There's a huge uncertainty in terms of what is being researched and what is the current state of the research. And there are obviously the secret military programs, but there's also the possibility that corporations could develop artificial intelligence in secrecy in order to get a competitive advantage. I don't know how to best address it. I think the biggest danger is that governments would develop that technology first. I mean, that's the most likely scenario, and that it would come out of a secret military project.
Yeah. Again,
and I don't know how to prevent that.
The development at this moment is actually done by companies because clearly being able to analyze data to make predictions on complex data is what gives you a competitive edge in business. I mean, in just selling things, for example. And I'm personally convinced that this is where most of the exciting research is actually going on. And of course, it will be very, very difficult to get hold of any information that describes what's being done in the big companies. And we all know which companies we are talking about.
Okay. So, Nicholas, do you have a question? Nicholas?
Yes, I'm here. Sorry. Thank you. I just tried to turn my video on. Thank you for that very interesting and, as Lee said, somewhat scary presentation. I just have a general question to ask you at the beginning. Given that we already have such massive lethal weapons at our disposal, ranging from the old-fashioned Gatling guns, machine guns, to battlefield nuclear weapons, etc., etc., etc. do you really think that these AI-developed weapons, if they arise, cause us any more problems than the problems that are already presented by the kind of weapons that we have at our disposal, which to some extent already embody certain computer-based technologies for guidance systems, for identifying targets, and so on and so forth? Are we really on the verge of moving into a new age, or is there not a danger that we might overstate the problem here?
Well, I think we need to consider the strategic context of conflict. And I think the big thing in the 21st century warfare is not going to be increasing lethality, it is going to be non-lethality. And that's a whole different kind of issue. So I'm not so worried about the Terminator kind of scenario of machines running amok and killing everybody. I'm more concerned about ubiquitous surveillance and the possibility that non-lethal means could be used for coercing a population. And that is a big issue with respect to neuroscience research, so other types of neuroweapons, biochemical neuroweapons, direct energy type weapons, and those could be more powerful if you add that element of ubiquitous automated surveillance.
Okay, I mean, thank you very much. Nicholas, unless you want to follow up on that, I have actually a couple of questions from the audience members as well.
Okay, over to you then, Lise.
Okay, great, thank you. So the first person I have on my list is Dave Lester. I just have to find him and unmute him on my list. Dave, yes, Dave, you're already good to go.
Yeah, okay. This was actually a question for the previous speaker about dual use. Am I coming through?
Yes, very good.
Okay. The issue I had was that what we're actually doing is constructing tools rather than applications. I'm part of SP9. And to give you a feel for that, the problem has been around for 200 years in that the Pax Britannica was imposed by prohibiting the export of machine tools, things like lathes. And if you think of a lathe as a 3D printer, an ancient form of 3D printer, you're not too far from the truth. You can use it to make anything you can actually conceive of and make a drawing for. And that's effectively what a modern compiler for a computer language is as well. It's a tool which is of use in constructing particular applications. And I think that some of the previous speakers, we should give some consideration to the fact that these kinds of tools here are actually tools for constructing tools and not just the end applications themselves. And that's what I understand to be the significant issue here in dual use. And I would appreciate some further pointers on this, perhaps as we go along with some of the other talks. So I think I'd like to leave it at that for the moment.
Malcolm, I've actually unmuted you if you would like to reply to this question.
To link it up with the last point made by the previous speaker in response to Nick, where the previous speaker argued that he thought that the non-lethality will be the main thrust of warfare in this coming decades. It seems to me that is a possible aspect of warfare in the coming decades, probably put forward by advanced technological countries for reasons which we can go into if we have time. But the main point I would like to make is that we can be absolutely certain that nasty warfare is going to continue for decades to come, and that opportunities will be taken to use advances in science and technology by various parties within these conflicts to pursue their objectives. And the point that is important, I think the point that the questioner is putting here is really how do we go about trying to constrain the kinds of possible means of warfare that we're going to have on our hands in coming decades? How do we, to the extent we can, minimize the damage done to people and property and cultures and all the rest of it in these coming conflict-ridden decades? And that seems to me to be the essential point that we're trying to talk about today.
Okay, thank you very much. Dave, would you like to comment?
There are obviously the application areas need serious consideration, and when you are actually designing an application, the ethical considerations are relatively straightforward. The design of technology which permits people to construct applications seems to me a much more fraught process, and that's what I was trying to highlight here. If I'm designing an autonomous weapon system, then there are various considerations, and the ethical issues involved with that seem to me, well, if not straightforward, then at least you know what you're up to, and you know what you're doing, and you must make your own ethical choices about this. If, however, I'm the constructor of the compiler that the weapons engineer is using, I have almost no control over the use of that compiler or tool that the person is using. Think of a spanner. It could be used in a military application. It could be used much more generally, and probably is used much more generally for other purposes. And I think that's, from my perspective in SP9, that's a much more realistic style of question to be asking. We are not, in the Human Brain Project, in SP9 at least, in the world of producing anything more than demonstrator applications. And those demonstrator applications will most certainly not be military. I would be surprised if the application group in SP11 are going to be constructing anything military as well. I know most of these people, and they seem respectable and ethical. The issue, though, is that the tools that we've constructed in the process of doing this will have dual use, and since they are, in fact, widely available, what then? What is the ethical position for the tool construction, which is what we're actually doing in the Human Brain Project?
Okay, Dave, thank you very much for this follow-up. I have many people who would like to ask questions now, which is a good sign, I think. I had from Nicholas Rose the request to ask a question raised by Steve Ferber in the chat or answer. I'm not sure exactly, Nicholas?
Yeah, thank you, Lise. I think Steve isn't able to ask his question because he's got a bad chest, so let me ask it.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's an absolutely crucial question. To be blunt about it, whether we like it or not, we are in a conflict-ridden world with a whole set of new conflicts which we haven't seen before, a whole set of new non-state actors using some very ancient technologies of fear and destruction and murder, and some very new technologies. And we're likely to be in this situation for many decades, in my view. And it's not just those non-state actors, but it's also state actors backing those non-state actors. So we need to move away, this is Steve's question, we need to move away from the assumption that all military uses are bad or malign, and to ask ourselves, well, what forms of military applications of these new technologies might in fact be desirable? Might in fact be desirable because they're less lethal, might in fact be desirable because they protect civilian populations from terrorism, might in fact be less lethal because they not just put our own soldiers and military personnel less at risk, but put those of the proxy armies that are fighting them less at risk. We only have to look at Syria or look at Libya, etc., etc., etc. So maybe that's a more challenging question, because it's not about not having military applications. It's a question about deciding which kinds of military applications we consider to be acceptable.
Who would like to?
Well, I'm very happy to say something about that.
That's great.
Okay, I actually agree with you, but let me say that when we're trying to look at this question of what military means are acceptable, we have to do it in the round, taking a very broad look at it. Take the question of whether new forms of chemical agents should be used for law enforcement purposes. So fentanyl in Moscow being an example of the use of a new form of incapacitant for law enforcement. The problem there is, if you look carefully at the debates within the Chemical Weapons Convention state parties, the worry is that if you say, yes, that form of non-lethality is acceptable, then it's very difficult to see where you end up without eroding the whole of the convention and the restriction on the use of toxic chemicals for hostile purposes. So yes, by all means, let's look at these questions about what kind of military force might be acceptable and might not be acceptable, but let's make sure we do it as broadly as possible.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Armin, do you have any comments on this question, and maybe in relation to some of your examples, we should look at what we want in warfare instead of what we don't want?
Well, yes, I want to contribute a few thoughts. One thing is, one of the biggest developments in warfare over the last 50 years is the rise of interstate conflict. So hardly any conflicts these days are between states. They all take place within a state. So then you get the whole issue of mixing military with law enforcement into some broader security. And then you get into the issue of oppression, so tyranny. So the government could use the technology for coercing a population, and that could be a big threat. And yeah, we are afraid of terrorists, but sometimes government label people terrorists just out of political convenience.